Welcome to the Crisis Averted podcast, produced by CJ Media Solutions. I'm your host, CJ Arlotta. In this episode, I speak with Andrea Holland, founder of RemotePRjobs.com and DialedPR.com. During our conversation, Andrea shared her thoughts on how businesses can avoid crises and provided some tips on how to move through a crisis if you're already in one. Feel free to send me your feedback at cj@cjmediasolutionsllc.com. Andrea can be reached at andrea@remoteprjobs.com or at Andrea Holland on Twitter. Thanks for listening. So Andrea, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Let's first dive into your background. I believe you worked in the corporate world for a bit, which is when we originally connected. And then you eventually decided it was time to branch out on your own to start your own PR firm, correct?
That's right. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to tell you a little bit about that. So I think you and I met when I was working for a large global PR agency in San Francisco. I can't remember what client or agency it was with, but clearly a bit ago in the IT space. But yeah, I spent nearly a decade in San Francisco working for large global PR firms. Clients were generally big box clients, Intuit, PayPal, Visa, helped launch LegalZoom. So, notable household names. And towards the end of that time, I actually started working with early stage startups at Well. In about 2014, I had a major life pivot, so to speak. I really wanted to leave San Francisco. I wanted to try and go hang my own shingle. And so I used it as an opportunity at that time, and I left and moved down to Santa Barbara, California. And at that time, there was a small yet emerging tech scene. There were startups here that were outsourcing to agencies in LA and New York. And I thought, wow, this is a perfect opportunity because I'm able to bring that experience, physically be here, and start building out from there. So it was really cool because I was really quickly able to carve out a niche and an area of the market that no one was really serving down here yet. And during that time, it's been about, it was 2014, almost 7 years now. During that time was really spent kind of building that slowly. And in the meantime, I also became an author, PR author instructor for LinkedIn Learning. So I have a few courses up on the platform right now that talk about how to write a press release, how to get your content published, how to launch your product or your service to the press. And those are on LinkedIn Learning, which was a really cool experience. And I've had a few other online ventures as well. And one of them is a remote PR job site that connects PR professionals to startups, nonprofits, corporations looking for PR help, and then vice versa, helping PR professionals fill their funnel.
So why did you decide to launch remote PR jobs, and why should PR professionals and businesses consider joining the community?
Sure. So one of the things when I started consulting, I realized very quickly, wow, a lot of my work is coming through word of mouth, which is such a blessing, right? And also through my network. I feel very blessed to have been trained and nurtured in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, the mecca of tech. And so I had a very strong network. And so for me, I felt very blessed because I thought, okay, great, this is where the work is coming from. But like any consultant, there's times where things are slow. And I remember there were certainly months where I would literally find myself Googling remote public relations contracts, freelance PR work, whatever it might have been. And nothing really ever came up. Yes, I was directed to the LinkedIns and the Upworks of the world, but nothing was overly specific to PR. And oftentimes when I find myself going to remote job sites, there were never any PR options. And I thought, this is really odd because I know there are a lot of people looking for these services. And what I kind of came to terms with was, I actually don't think a lot of businesses or startups necessarily understand the value of PR or what they can bring to them, because you're not going to ask for something if you don't know what it can do for you. So I thought, man, I can't believe there's not one site dedicated to this. And so at the end of 2018, I just decided to kind of test it out. I spent one afternoon and I scoured a bunch of job sites and I pulled out what I felt to be, based on my experience, the top 10, freelance remote PR jobs that I could find. Put them into an email, sent it out to about 20 freelance PR friends and said, hey, is this helpful for you? Of course, they all responded, yes, thank you. You're sending us leads, right? And I was like, okay, all right. So I'm just testing for viability at this point. Did it again the next week. Soon it got to a point where, it was, hey, can so-and-so be added to your email? Hey, I forwarded this. Can so-and-so be added to your email? Soon after that, kind of threw it in MailChimp. And so people could subscribe to it and just kept building from there. And now it's an actual like subscription site.
And now there's also a blog on remote PR jobs where you provide your thoughts on PR for businesses. And recently you published a blog post on things businesses can do to avoid getting into a crisis. In it, you provide some practical advice for business owners. So I'd like to kind of go over some of the points you highlighted in the blog post, the first of which being
Sure.
the importance of understanding your competitive landscape. What do you mean by that?
Sure. Yeah, people, how timely, right, for what we're
Mhm.
going through right now. But that's a lot more, that's vague to just like crisis in general, because I find that a lot of times people get into crisis because, they weren't preventative in certain areas, right? Obviously, something like what's going on in the world right now, we can't control.
Mhm.
But, generally speaking, if we're talking about crisis on just like a regular ongoing macro level, I think there's a few things that can be. And when I'm talking about, understanding your competitive landscape, if you don't understand what's going on around you, whether that is in the news cycle or whether that is in the competition that is in your industry, you're kind of doomed to fail. Oftentimes that's the first, as a former reporter, I'm sure like what are the questions you're going to ask? Why should I care right now? Why are you different? Who are you, right? And so I think understanding that is really important when telling your story. And also, for example, if you're in a space that may be controversial and you want to make sure that you are really standing out and you're not the same as perhaps a competitor in the same space that is getting negative coverage for whatever reason. But you have to understand why they're getting negative coverage, right? So that's why I say understanding what's going on around you is incredibly important. And that starts with your messaging and whatnot.
How do you do that? Pay attention to what's going on. Is it really just about, do you have any monitoring services that you use? Do you just pay attention to what's going on in the various trade publications?
I think as a PR professional, I just read a lot.
Mhm.
I have news sources, whether it's set up for Google News or whatnot. I don't have a lot of rhyme and reason to that, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
But, depending on what clients I work with, I definitely read the industries that they're in. I read a lot about what their competition is doing so I'm educated in that. I use Twitter for a lot of news sourcing as well. I definitely, I use that to curate news. And I listen to a lot of podcasts. That's not necessarily all real time, but that's generally how I consume my information.
Do you use LinkedIn at all?
LinkedIn, yeah, definitely. Especially I think if that's a really good one too, because if I see people that I really respect posting things, I'm probably apt to go read that article. And so, LinkedIn gives you the functionality to follow, different kinds of thought leaders and stuff. And so that's definitely a source for news for me as well, because obviously stuff that really goes viral you see on there too. So I think you're really seeing the latest.
Yeah, and you can really dive into what some of your executives in your space are thinking and how they're kind of pushing out their thoughts on the industry in general, on their company and their competitors as well.
Totally. I think it's super important to be in tune with your competition and what's happening in the news cycle, because what's the backbone of your entire company? It's your messaging, right? Your messaging, your narrative is your backbone of every single piece of communication for your company. That's internally, that's externally. I don't think a lot of people realize that. Your messaging, everything from a blog post to a social media post to an internal company communication. It all has to be aligned. It's all connected. And to write that and to really have a good set of messaging, you have to know what's going on around you.
Yeah, and that's really tough for a lot of small business owners trying to stay on top of all that with all the outlets they can use to brand themselves. Sometimes it can get themselves into trouble.
Right. Well, one thing I kind of recommend to people too, to keep it simple, and I do this, is I always set a Google alert for my client's name, but also for the competition as well. So, if there's days where I really am I didn't know to look for that. Obviously, I don't know what's coming down the pipe, but sometimes it's easy as that to get as delivered. So there's little tactics like that. Set up your RSS news feeds, to certain key terms and whatnot. But oftentimes it's following your competition as closely as you're following your client, in my experience.
Now, even though you should be aware of what's going on around you, you shouldn't necessarily directly attack competitors when things aren't going your way, right? That can lead you down a path you wish you hadn't gone down, correct?
I would totally agree with that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I see that a lot. I mean, I think another thing to really prevent yourself from going into crisis is worry about yourself. Worry about yourself, not your competition. To pay attention to your competition,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't control other people, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can control yourself. You can control what you put out into the world. You can control how you react. And I think it's normal though, right? I mean, if you have competition that's really like biting at your ankles in a sense, it's really normal to say like, we are better than, and then name them, and here's why. That's the first thing you want to say to a reporter. Well, this company, well, we're way better than for them and why. And that's actually not the right thing to do. I think there are good ways and bad ways to handle that. I think it's important to address competition without attacking them. You never want to say their name. Mm. You want to focus on you, right? You want to talk about your product, your service, why you're different, why you're better. I mean, if your service or your app or your product or your executive is really that superior, you don't need to name any names.
And how do you kind of manage that with clients? Because I'm sure there are some clients who kind of do want to go out there and be a little bit more aggressive. How do you kind of talk them down?
Totally. I mean, I just explain it kind of just like that. I think it's really tacky. First of all, I mean, I think it's like, think about when you're a kid, it's like so-and-so, tattled on me, right? I mean, it's almost reverting back to like when we were children. It's like, well, no, like they're not the issue, like, right? I mean, they're not the issue. Your job is to create a product or a service or a brand that is serving for something. It's solving for something. It's helping something. And that's your only job, is to make sure that it's better. And that's what you talk about, and that's exactly how I explain to them. I'm like, this is in fact, if your product or service is really that much better than sliced bread, they're like, then you won't have to name any names. Mm-hmm. But I do explain, I think it's tacky, and I think it's kind of lowball, and it's just not necessary. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's a lot better ways to talk about your business. Why give airtime to somebody else, Mm-hmm.
And that goes all into the attitude. And sometimes your attitude obviously can get you in a lot of trouble. Can you talk a bit about how simply being kind can prevent a crisis from unfolding?
I know, right? I actually just, this morning I was listening to a podcast just during the coronavirus stuff. Right now, there's a lot of reporters and PR people talking about what is the best way, to be pitching right now. What is the best way to be talking about your products? Is the right time to be talking about your products? But the main thing that kind of shone through with that I would also agree with is be mindful, be kind, be honest, be real, be candid. And I mean, there are times when things just happen, right? I mean, if we're getting down to a specific example of, say you're in crisis about something, say a reporter breaks an embargo or chooses to write an angle that portrays your company in a negative light. I've been in this situation a few times, and it's been those traits that have kind of gotten me and my client through it. I'll give you one example. It was probably in like late 2015. I was working with a really large publicly traded company, mm-hmm. and they were putting out a really material piece of news. And it was a big piece of news. We probably pre-briefed 20 journalists on it, and it was a tight embargo. And, the embargo was important in this case, because if it was to get out earlier, it truly would have caused material damage to the company. So we were all set to go, like the pre-briefs were completed. The embargo was to lift the next day. Well, I was on a ski lift with my family when I got a text saying that one of the reporters chose to leak the story early, and it was live. And I was like, oh, this is the longest chair ride of my life.
Right, yeah.
Because the problem with that is, I mean, usually you can only go back to a reporter and offer to fix something, or ask for something to be changed if it's factually incorrect. Well, this is one of those cases as well where this was going to cause material damage. So I knew that I would have to be giving him a call, right? So I thought about, how am I going to approach this? I can approach this super angry and demanding, or I could see if there was a reason, like, what's the reason this happened? Was this a mistake? Did they not understand? And I think approaching anything with empathy and kindness is going to get you a lot further, just in general in life. So, although I was angry, when I called, I was not angry, and I explained, I explained the why. This is how it's impacting us. This broken embargo is really going to cause some material damage to the company, and this is why. I acknowledge that this is your right to speak freely. But I really tried to calmly express the implications that the actions had, and can we work together to find a solution here? And ultimately, the reporter was able to remove the piece and apologize. And, I can't say what the outcome would have been had I called demanding and whatnot, in that situation. But I'd like to think that just explaining the why, explaining how it could be causing damage to someone else. We're all humans here, right? And usually it's how I choose to approach things in general.
What was the reporter's reasoning for breaking that embargo? Do you remember? Or were they just trying to get the scoop, or did they have a good reason?
They just wanted to get, no, they just really wanted, it was a big piece of news and they just really wanted to be the first to break it. So it was unfortunate.
That goes into really being able to manage those relationships with reporters, right? That's where a PR professional really comes in handy. It's not just being able to pitch to the media, but it's being able to have those relationships with reporters to kind of have that candid conversation in instances like that, right?
Totally. I mean, it's a lot easier. I feel very blessed that I had a relationship with that reporter, for sure. I mean, I would have approached it the same way had I not, but in that instance, it was because in that instance, it was a lot easier for me to have that conversation because I knew him as a person. Mm-hmm. But I do think that's important because think if you have a human connection relationship with anyone, like any type of conversation, whether it's, trying to get some of their ear to like listen to your story or them trusting you to give them a source. It's a two-way street, right?
Sure.
So yeah, definitely. I encourage that. And I think, especially in times of crisis, I think that really comes in handy. I think I was listening to this podcast this morning, like I mentioned, and one of the reporters on it, that's exactly what he said. Actually, he's like, now's the time to use your relationships, and not in an opportunistic way, but in a human way. Be candid, be real, be thoughtful, be mindful. And whatever crisis you're in, those are just really important key human traits that I think are really important to keep in mind.
Now, here's something that's a little controversial, but what about capitalizing on a crisis? Should you? What are some of the downsides?
Capitalizing on a crisis. I mean, I feel like being opportunistic in a time when there is a true crisis, like when people are suffering, when businesses are going under, I think that's very tacky, and I think it's not mindful. And no, I don't think that's the right thing to do at all. I think it can be really harmful. And I also think that reporters can see right through it, but I think there are ways to, it's not like, for example, again, I'll reference this, we're in this coronavirus, pandemic right now.
Sure.
I think I was listening to this podcast and they said, listen, we do want to hear the good news, right? Yes, the top of our stories are going to be about coronavirus. Our main roundups and our themes is how can it not be right now? That said, people want a reprieve and people want to hear the good news. And they want to hear about things that are going to help them. Not every single company is going to have something related to that. So that's where I think especially it's important to be mindful of that. I think you just have to be candid about why you think you're relevant. One of the examples they gave this morning was, I got pitched by a dating app last week. And I thought, okay, well, maybe there's some angle to this that's appropriate to right now. Maybe it's completely remote, or maybe it's related to something. It doesn't have to be directly tied to coronavirus. But as I read through the pitch, there was nothing. It was still in-person dating. And so it was like, okay, this could be interesting, but this really has no connection right now. So is that appropriate right now? Probably not. So I think it goes back to, if you're capitalizing on a crisis and you're putting in your headline, because of this crisis, our company is doing X, Y, Z. It's tough, right? I'm not a crisis communications expert. I've definitely dealt with crisis, but I definitely told clients in the last month or so, or in the last few weeks we've been doing this, let's not use that as an angle. If we can add value, I think that's the biggest thing. If you can add value and you're mindful about there is a connection that can help people, I think that's your move right now.
It's interesting because I think a lot of that's going on, and I'm sure you've been noticing it too, is that a lot of reporters, they're obviously being pitched news about the COVID-19 outbreak, and a lot of them are writing stories to businesses, for businesses, and for PR professionals to let them know, this is what we're looking for. We don't want you exploiting the outbreak for business means. These are some ways to go about it. It kind of goes back to that relationship aspect that we were talking about before. They're out there informing everybody. If you want to pitch a story, this is the way to go about it during this crisis.
Sure. Yeah, and another thing that was interesting that I heard from a journalist recently was, during this time, don't push anything down our throats. Don't push a story down our throats. What's a better way to approach this would be, here are the 10 clients that I'm working with right now. Would any of them be of value to you? How can I help you? How can I help you do your job better right now? Instead of pushing your own agenda. I think in general, this is a good time for us to be helping and supporting each other as much as possible. But you can imagine journalism right now. It's like one after another, after another, after another. And if you're offering to help, if you have a good source, if you're giving them kind of a menu of here's what I have, you tell me what you need. That was something that seemed to be received pretty well.
Yeah, that's key. I always try to do that when pitching with reporters. Obviously, I want them to cover my clients' news, but I also want to be a resource to them. I want to help them with their stories.
Right.
What are they working on? How can a client of mine provide value? If a client of mine can't provide value, do I know somebody who can provide value to the story you're working on? It's really about working on that relationship. It's the give and take you were talking about before.
Totally. And I think that's a really way people often ask me, how do I build a relationship with a reporter? Well, think about if you wanted to make a new friend. Are you going to be friends with the person that is always constantly coming to you and asking for something, or the friend that is constantly coming to you and needing something, or telling you to do something, asking you to do something when you don't feel that it's reciprocated?
Right.
Probably not.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that you can help them, that you can support them is, I've done that before. I've sent reporters sources for things, and I don't even have clients related to it, but I'm like, oh, this sounds really interesting. Or I just met this person. This could probably help you in some capacity. You never know.
Now, sometimes business owners don't prepare for crises, unfortunately. So if they're already in crisis, what should they do? Do you have any tips for them?
Sure. Yeah, just general tips on kind of how to move through crisis, separate from what's going on in the world right now. I think a big thing, and especially I've noticed now, is if you don't have to say anything, don't. You don't have to react to everything. Right. And I guess maybe I will tie it into what's going on right now, because I did see a few examples that kind of caught my eye, and I was like, all of a sudden, like everyone else in the world, I started receiving an email from every single mailing list or company that I've ever been on that I forgot I was part of.
So many CEOs.
I'm like, I went to your yoga studio once 11 years ago. I forgot about this, and it's explaining, here's what we're going to do for coronavirus, and here are tips, and here are this, and it's like, whoa, okay. And so two things. One, I didn't feel like all of them were necessary. I kind of felt at times like, okay, maybe you feel as a business, because everyone else is doing this, I have to do this. And I don't believe that's the case. We all know what's going on. We're all in this together. Everyone feels the gravity of it. But beyond that, I did read through quite a bit of them, and I was really surprised at how much of the information was factually incorrect. And that to me was the scary part, because, not everyone is qualified or relevant to be, giving advice on necessarily how to cure this or how to get through this time, right? I think your job, one, you don't need to say anything. If you don't need to say anything, you don't have to. Really choose what you react to and what you don't. And just because every other company is reacting doesn't mean you need to. And don't feel bad about it, especially if there's already a lot of noise out there. I think people will actually really appreciate that. And if you are going to, make sure your facts are correct. What else? Or go on.
No, I was going to say, and it's also important, not to, like you were saying before, don't give advice unless it's really your area of expertise, right?
Right. I would totally agree with that. If you're responding to something that you're not an expert in, medical, political, whatever it be, I think you need to be really careful not to give advice. Give the facts. You can't go wrong with that. Check your sources, but it's just not your job to tell people what to do. Provide them with accurate information, and they can decide what to do. I'm not going to take advice from somebody, in aerospace about something that's going on with a local restaurant. It's probably
Right.
a terrible example, but you know what I'm saying. Like,
Right. Right.
Yeah, and I think so. Sticking to the facts, you can't go wrong with objective facts. I think what else when you're in crisis, especially, and a lot of times in crisis, you have really heightened emotions, and I think it's really important to, say with whether your customers or your employees, and it's important to take account other people's emotions, especially if they are the ones going through crisis. I think, regardless of whatever you're going through, humankind goes a very, very long way. And thinking through the emotional aspects of what people are going through is really important. And I think that kind of ties into the tone of your messaging as well. Like whether it's the media, your customers, it's so easy to live in a state of panic when you're in crisis, as I know so much of us are feeling right now. But a calm and objective demeanor really goes a long way. And I would say the last thing, if you're in crisis right now, just remember, like, be helpful. Don't be opportunistic, be helpful, add value. Content is a great example. If you're putting out content, are you an industry expert or are you just in the industry? I think that's important to kind of note and recognize, because when people are panicking, they're zeroing in on certain things, and you just want to be accurate and you want to be helpful at the end of the day.
Well, Andrea, I appreciate your thoughts and insights today, and I hope to catch up with you soon.
Definitely. Thanks, CJ. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Stay safe. Bye.